What I'm about to share with you happened during a completely ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Milan, Italy, yet it changed everything I thought I knew about faith, destiny, and the mysterious ways God works through the most unexpected people. Before I continue, I'd love to know, are you watching this from your home, perhaps during a quiet moment, or maybe you're listening while commuting? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're tuning in from around the world. And if this story touches your heart, please hit that subscribe button, because today's testimony might just be the message you've been waiting to hear. My name is Francesco Romano, and I'm a 42-year-old software engineer who, until 3 years ago, considered myself a practical man, guided purely by logic and evidence. I attended Mass sporadically, mostly during holidays or family gatherings, and treated faith as a cultural tradition rather than a living relationship with God. My world revolved around algorithms, code, and the predictable patterns of technology. I thought I had life figured out until I met a teenager who would shatter every assumption I held about the supernatural, prophecy, and the incredible power of authentic holiness. The encounter happened in the most mundane setting imaginable, a small cafe near the Cathedral of Milan, where I often grabbed my morning espresso before work. I was hunched over my laptop, debugging a particularly stubborn piece of software, when I noticed someone had left a small prayer card on the table next to mine. The image showed a young man with bright eyes and an infectious smile holding what appeared to be a laptop computer, an unusual sight for a holy card. The name at the bottom read Beato Carlo Acutis. I'd never heard of him, but something about his expression struck me as remarkably modern, almost as if he could have been any teenager from our digital generation. That's when I first saw him, not the image on the card, but Carlo himself, sitting alone at a corner table, typing intently on a laptop that seemed oddly familiar. He was wearing simple jeans and sneakers, looking exactly like any other 15-year-old, except for an unmistakable radiance that seemed to emanate from within. I rubbed my eyes, assuming it was fatigue from staring at screens too long, but when I looked again, he was still there, completely absorbed in his work, yet somehow aware of everything happening around him. What happened next defied every rational explanation I could offer. Carlo looked up from his computer, made direct eye contact with me, and smiled with such warmth and recognition that it felt as though we were old friends reuniting after a long separation. He stood up, walked over to my table, and asked in perfect Italian with a slight British accent, "Mind if I join you? I think we might have more in common than you realize." His voice carried a confidence that seemed impossible for someone so young, yet it was tempered with genuine kindness and curiosity. Against every instinct of my logical mind, I found myself nodding and gesturing to the empty chair across from me. Carlo sat down, glanced at my laptop screen, and immediately identified the exact nature of the coding problem I'd been struggling with for hours. "You're trying to create a database that can handle real-time data synchronization," he observed, "but you're overthinking the architecture. Sometimes the most elegant solutions are also the simplest ones." He was right, of course, and within minutes he'd helped me see the solution that had been staring me in the face. But what struck me most wasn't his technical knowledge. It was the way he spoke about programming, as if it were a form of prayer, a method of bringing order to chaos and connecting disparate elements into something beautiful and functional. "Every line of code is like a small act of creation," he explained, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "When we build something that works, something that serves others and makes their lives better, we're participating in God's ongoing creation of the world." I'd never heard anyone speak about technology with such reverence and spiritual depth. As our conversation deepened, Carlo began sharing something that would fundamentally alter my understanding of faith and divine intervention. He told me about dreams, not ordinary dreams, but vivid prophetic experiences that had been visiting him since childhood, growing more intense and specific as he approached his 15th birthday. "In these dreams," he explained, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I see the future of the church, the struggles that lie ahead, and the role that ordinary people like you and me are meant to play in God's plan for humanity." He described visions that seemed both beautiful and alarming. Vast crowds of young people rediscovering authentic faith through digital platforms, priests finding renewed purpose in forgotten traditions, and families being healed through encounters with the Eucharist that defied medical explanation. But alongside these hopeful images, he also saw periods of confusion, division, and spiritual drought that would test the faith of even the most devoted believers. The strangest part, Carlo continued, is that in every dream, I'm watching these events unfold from a place that feels like heaven, as if I'm observing from outside of time itself. What made these revelations even more extraordinary was Carlo's matter-of-fact delivery. He spoke about prophetic dreams with the same casualness that other teenagers might discuss their weekend plans or favorite video games. There was no drama, no attempt to impress or mystify, just a simple, honest sharing of experiences that he clearly considered both a gift and a responsibility. "I don't pretend to understand why God chooses to show me these things," he admitted, "but I know I'm supposed to prepare others for what's coming, especially through the Eucharist." Carlo then shared the most startling revelation of all. In his most recent dream, he had seen himself, this very conversation, in this very cafe, with a software engineer who would become instrumental in spreading his message through modern technology. "You're going to help people understand that holiness isn't outdated or incompatible with the digital age," he told me, his eyes filled with conviction. "In fact, technology is going to be one of the primary vehicles through which God reaches the hearts of the next generation." The precision of his description was unsettling. He knew details about my work that I hadn't mentioned, my struggles with faith, even my mother's recent health concerns that I hadn't discussed with anyone. When I expressed my amazement, Carlo simply smiled and said, "The Holy Spirit connects all things, Francesco. Once you learn to listen with your heart instead of just your mind, you'll be amazed at how clearly God speaks to those who are willing to pay attention." Before I could fully process what was happening, Carlo stood up and prepared to leave, but not before placing his hand briefly on my shoulder. The touch was warm, reassuring, and somehow filled me with a peace I hadn't experienced in years. "I want you to know something important," he said, his voice taking on an almost otherworldly quality. "My time here is shorter than most people realize, but the work we're meant to do together will continue long after I'm gone. When you're ready to begin, you'll know exactly what to do." And with that simple statement, he picked up his laptop and walked away, disappearing into the crowded streets of Milan as suddenly as he had appeared. If you're still with me on this incredible journey, and if something about Carlo's story is resonating in your heart, please don't just keep scrolling. Hit that subscribe button right now, and in the comments, share with me. Have you ever experienced a moment when you knew without doubt that God was speaking directly to you? Your testimony might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, and while you're there, share this video with one person who you think might benefit from Carlo's message. Because sometimes, the most ordinary moments become the most extraordinary encounters when we're open to the miraculous. Following that extraordinary first meeting, my life took on a completely different rhythm. I found myself returning to that same cafe every morning, not entirely sure why, but feeling drawn there by a force I couldn't explain. For 3 days I sat alone with my espresso, wrestling with questions about what had really happened and whether I had simply experienced an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and overwork. But on the 4th morning, Carlo appeared again, this time carrying a small backpack and wearing an expression of quiet joy that immediately put me at ease. "I hoped you'd come back," he said, settling into the chair across from me, as if no time had passed at all. "There's something I want to show you, but first tell me about your week. How has your prayer life been?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't mentioned prayer during our previous conversation, and honestly I hadn't prayed consistently in years. When I confessed this somewhat sheepishly, Carlo's response surprised me with its gentleness and understanding. "Don't worry," he said with a knowing smile. "God doesn't measure love by the quantity of words we speak to him, but by the sincerity of our desire to know him better." Carlo reached into his backpack and pulled out what appeared to be a tablet computer, though it looked unlike any device I'd seen before. The screen seemed to glow with an inner light that was somehow both modern and ancient, technological yet mystical. "This is my current project," he explained, his fingers dancing across the interface with practiced ease. "I'm documenting every authenticated Eucharistic miracle that has occurred throughout history. But I'm not just collecting data. I'm trying to understand the pattern, the divine logic behind when and why God chooses to manifest his presence in such dramatic ways." As Carlo navigated through the digital archive, I was amazed by the depth and sophistication of his research. He had compiled testimonies, medical reports, photographs, and historical documents that traced Eucharistic phenomena from the early centuries of Christianity through the present day. But what made his work truly extraordinary was his analysis, the way he connected these miraculous events to periods of spiritual crisis, social upheaval, and the particular needs of local communities where they occurred. "Look at this pattern," Carlo said, pointing to a timeline he had created. "Throughout history, God has used the Eucharist to call his people back to what's essential whenever they've become distracted by worldly concerns or confused by false teachings. Each miracle is like a love letter, a reminder that Jesus is truly present, truly available, truly longing to transform our hearts if we just believe and approach with faith." His passion for this research was infectious, and I found myself drawn into his vision of the Eucharist as the beating heart of authentic spiritual life. Over the following weeks, our morning conversations became the highlight of my day. Carlo would arrive with new discoveries, fresh insights, and always an infectious enthusiasm for the ways God was working in the modern world. He showed me videos of young people his age discovering profound faith through social media, stories of miraculous healings that had occurred during Mass, and testimonies from priests who had rediscovered their vocational joy through deeper devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. What struck me most about Carlo during this period was his remarkable balance between supernatural awareness and completely normal teenage interests. He could discuss the theological implications of Eucharistic miracles with the sophistication of a seasoned theologian, then seamlessly transition to conversations about the latest programming languages, video game strategies, or his favorite soccer teams. He embodied a kind of holiness that was neither stuffy nor pretentious. It was joyful, accessible, and deeply attractive to anyone seeking authentic spiritual life. One morning in early October, Carlo arrived at our usual meeting spot with a more serious demeanor than I had previously seen. He sat down slowly, as if carrying a heavy burden, and took a long moment before speaking. "Francesco," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I need to tell you something important about why God brought us together and about what's going to happen in my life very soon." There was something in his tone that made my heart skip a beat, a mixture of peace and sadness that I couldn't quite understand, but that filled me with an inexplicable sense of urgency. During what would become one of our most profound conversations, Carlo began sharing details about his dreams that went far beyond anything he had previously revealed. His hands moved expressively as he described visions that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of time and space, prophecies that were both beautiful and sobering in their implications for the future of faith in the 21st century. "In my most vivid dream," Carlo began, his eyes taking on a distant quality as if he were seeing the events unfold in real time, "I witnessed a great awakening among young people who had been written off by the Church as hopelessly secular and materialistic. But God reached them through the very technologies that older generations feared were destroying their faith. Social media platforms became vehicles for spreading devotion to the Eucharist, gaming communities transformed into prayer networks, and virtual reality experiences allowed people to participate in Mass with a depth of engagement they had never experienced in physical churches." He described seeing massive crowds of teenagers and young adults gathering in public squares, not for political protests or entertainment events, but for Eucharistic adoration. "They came carrying their smartphones and tablets," Carlo explained with growing excitement. "But instead of being distracted by these devices, they used them to share images of the Blessed Sacrament, to live-stream adoration sessions, and to create digital art that helped others understand the beauty and mystery of God's presence in the Eucharist." But Carlo's visions also included darker elements that troubled him deeply. He saw periods when confusion would reign even within church leadership, when faithful Catholics would find themselves questioning basic teachings they had always taken for granted. "There will be times," he said with obvious sadness, "when people will have to choose between popular opinion and eternal truth, when standing up for traditional Catholic teaching will require real courage and might cost friendships, careers, or social acceptance." What made these prophecies particularly striking was Carlo's insistence that the solutions to future challenges already existed in present moments of grace. "Every time someone chooses to spend an extra few minutes in prayer after Mass," he explained, "every time a young person decides to put away their phone and focus completely on the Eucharist, every time someone shares their faith story with courage and authenticity, these small acts of devotion create ripples that will become waves of renewal when the Church needs them most." Carlo then shared something that would haunt me for months to come: his detailed knowledge of his own approaching death. "I dream about my funeral," he said matter-of-factly, with no trace of fear or self-pity. "I see my body lying in a simple wooden casket, surrounded by flowers and candles, while people from all over the world come to pray. But the strangest part is that I can see their prayers rising like incense, and I understand that my death isn't an ending. It's the beginning of a mission that will reach far more people than anything I could accomplish in a normal lifetime." He described seeing his mother years after his death, traveling to distant countries and sharing his story with audiences who would be moved to tears by his simple message of Eucharistic devotion. "She'll carry a relic of my heart," Carlo said with a smile that mixed joy and melancholy, "and everywhere she goes, people will be reminded that holiness isn't complicated. It just requires saying yes to God each day, in small ways that anyone can manage." During our final week of conversations, Carlo began preparing me for what he called the time after. He explained that our friendship had been orchestrated by God not just for my own spiritual growth, but to create a witness who could testify to his authentic humanity alongside his extraordinary spiritual gifts. "People need to understand that sanctity doesn't make someone less human," he insisted. "I love pizza and video games just as much as I love Jesus in the Eucharist. I get excited about programming projects and soccer matches, as well as about prayer and serving others. Holiness doesn't eliminate personality, it perfects it." Carlo's final prophetic revelation concerned the role that technology would play in the spread of his devotion after death. "You're going to help people understand," he told me with absolute conviction, "that God can work through YouTube videos and social media posts just as powerfully as he works through traditional forms of evangelization. The young saints of the future will be digital natives who use every available platform to share the joy of knowing Jesus." The most extraordinary revelation came during our final conversation on a crisp October morning, when the autumn light streaming through the cafe windows seemed to illuminate Carlo with an almost ethereal glow. He had arrived earlier than usual, and I could sense immediately that this meeting would be different from all the others. There was a solemnity about him, mixed with an underlying peace that seemed to transcend his 15 years, as if he were already beginning to exist partially in another dimension. "Francesco," Carlo began, his voice carrying a weight I had never heard before, "today I need to tell you about the most important dream I've ever received, the one that explains why God allowed us to meet and what he expects from both of us in the time that's coming." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, then continued with an intensity that commanded my complete attention. 3 nights ago, I was shown the exact moment of my death, and more importantly, I was shown what needs to happen afterward to ensure that God's plan unfolds as he intends. Carlo described a vision that was both beautiful and heartbreaking in its clarity. He saw himself in a hospital bed, surrounded by family, peacefully surrendering his life to God, while offering his suffering for the salvation of souls who had lost their way in a world of spiritual confusion. "But the remarkable thing," he explained, "isn't my death itself. It's what begins to happen immediately afterward. I saw streams of light flowing out from my body and spreading across the earth, reaching into the hearts of young people who were struggling with doubt, addiction, depression, and the feeling that their lives had no ultimate purpose. The prophetic vision included specific details about how his story would spread in the years following his death. Carlo saw his mother becoming an unexpected evangelist, traveling to places she had never imagined visiting, sharing his message with audiences who would be deeply moved by the simplicity and authenticity of his approach to holiness. "She'll be afraid at first," Carlo admitted, "because she's a private person who never sought public attention. But she'll find the courage when she realizes that every person who encounters my story represents a soul that God wants to draw closer to himself." But perhaps the most startling element of Carlo's prophecy concerned the role I would play in spreading his message through digital platforms. "You're going to create videos and websites that reach millions of people," he told me with absolute certainty. "Not because you're seeking fame or recognition, but because you'll understand that technology can be a powerful tool for evangelization when it's used with pure intentions and guided by prayer." Carlo then shared specific details about miraculous events that would begin occurring after his death. Healings that would take place when people prayed for his intercession, conversions that would happen when individuals encountered his story at moments of crisis, and vocations to priesthood and religious life that would be inspired by his example of joyful, committed faith. "The Church will eventually recognize these miracles officially," he said with quiet confidence, "and when that happens, it will be a sign that God is calling his people to rediscover the centrality of the Eucharist in their spiritual lives." What made these revelations even more extraordinary was Carlo's concern that his message not be misunderstood or distorted by those who might try to use his story for their own purposes. "I want people to understand that I'm not special because I had mystical experiences or prophetic dreams," he emphasized. "I'm special because I chose, day after day, to say yes to God in the ordinary moments of life. When I woke up and chose prayer over sleeping in, when I decided to attend Mass instead of playing video games, when I helped others instead of focusing only on my own interests." Carlo's final prophetic word concerned the future of young people in the Church. He saw a generation that would face unprecedented challenges and temptations, but also unprecedented opportunities to encounter God through new forms of technology and communication. "The young saints of the next century will be those who learn to use social media for prayer, who create digital content that draws people to the Eucharist, and who demonstrate that it's possible to be completely modern and completely Catholic at the same time." As our conversation drew to a close, Carlo reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm and warm, and I felt a strange sensation, as if grace itself were flowing through his fingers into my heart. "Promise me something, Francesco," he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "When the time comes for you to share my story, don't make me sound like a plaster saint who was too good to be real. Help people understand that sanctity is accessible to anyone who's willing to make small sacrifices out of love for Jesus. That's the real miracle. Not that God chose someone extraordinary, but that he can make anyone extraordinary when they say yes to his grace." Less than 2 weeks after our final conversation, I received news that would forever change my understanding of divine providence and the mysterious ways God works through human suffering. Carlo Acutis had been admitted to the hospital with what initially appeared to be a severe case of the flu, but was quickly diagnosed as acute leukemia, a form so aggressive that doctors offered little hope for recovery. When I learned of his condition, I immediately wanted to visit him, but his family was limiting visitors to immediate relatives during what everyone knew would be his final days. Instead, I found myself drawn to spend hours each day in Eucharistic adoration at the Cathedral of Milan, praying not just for Carlo's healing, but for the grace to understand why God would call such an extraordinary young person home so early. During these prayer sessions, I experienced something I had never encountered before, a profound sense of Carlo's presence, as if he were praying alongside me despite being physically confined to a hospital bed across the city. I could almost hear his voice encouraging me to trust in God's plan, even when it defied human understanding and broke our hearts with its apparent cruelty. On the evening of October 12, 2006, while I knelt before the Blessed Sacrament in the cathedral's side chapel, I suddenly felt an overwhelming wave of peace wash over me, followed immediately by the inexplicable conviction that Carlo had just entered eternal life. Later, I would learn that this sensation occurred at the exact moment of his death, when he peacefully surrendered his spirit to God after offering his final sufferings for the salvation of souls who didn't yet know how much God loved them. Carlo's funeral was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Despite his youth and the relatively small circle of people who knew him personally, hundreds of mourners filled the church, many of them teenagers who had somehow learned of his story and felt compelled to pay their respects. What struck me most was the atmosphere. Rather than the heavy grief that usually accompanies the death of someone so young, there was an unmistakable sense of joy, hope, and celebration that seemed to emanate from Carlo's simple wooden casket. During the funeral mass, Carlo's mother stood to deliver a brief testimony that would later prove to be prophetic in its own right. With remarkable composure, she shared how Carlo had prepared his family for this moment, not through morbid preoccupation with death, but through his constant reminder that life's purpose is to love God and serve others with joy. He told us, she said through tears that were somehow luminous with peace, that his real work would begin after his death, and that we would see signs of God's presence in ways that would amaze and comfort us. The first sign appeared just 3 days after Carlo's burial. A young woman named Maria, who had been struggling with severe depression and contemplating suicide, attended Mass at the cathedral where Carlo had often prayed. During Eucharistic adoration, she found herself drawn to kneel in the exact spot where I had experienced that overwhelming sense of peace on the night of Carlo's death. As she prayed desperately for some reason to continue living, she suddenly felt an unmistakable presence beside her, a gentle, joyful energy that filled her with hope and the absolute conviction that her life had purpose and meaning. When Maria approached me after Mass to share her experience, I was stunned to hear her describe Carlo exactly as I had known him, despite her insistence that she had never met him or even heard his name before that day. She spoke of feeling surrounded by a love that was both completely human and unmistakably divine, of receiving the clear message that God had specific plans for her life that required her continued presence in the world. From that moment forward, Maria's depression began to lift, and she eventually became a catechist who helped countless young people discover the joy of authentic faith. This was only the beginning. Over the following months, I began documenting similar encounters that people reported after praying for Carlo's intercession. A teenager in Naples was instantly healed of a brain tumor after his parents placed Carlo's prayer card on his forehead during surgery. A young man in Brazil, addicted to drugs and living on the streets, experienced a complete transformation after finding a picture of Carlo in a church where he had sought shelter from a storm. A family in the Philippines reported that their autistic son spoke his first words after they began praying to Carlo for help with his condition. Each of these accounts was thoroughly investigated by church authorities, medical professionals, and independent witnesses. What emerged was a pattern of miracles that defied scientific explanation but followed a clear spiritual logic. God was honoring Carlo's intercession in ways that revealed his particular love for young people, families in crisis, and anyone who felt abandoned or forgotten by the world. As I compiled these testimonies and began sharing Carlo's story through digital platforms, I realized that his prophecy about my role in spreading his message was coming true in ways I never could have imagined. Videos about his life and miracles reached millions of viewers, inspiring countless young people to rediscover the beauty of Eucharistic devotion and to understand that holiness was not only possible in the modern world, but desperately needed. Today, more than 17 years after Carlo's death, I find myself profoundly transformed by our brief but life-altering friendship. What began as a series of unexpected encounters in a small Milanese cafe evolved into a mission that has taken me to countries I never imagined visiting, speaking to audiences I never thought would be interested in my testimony, and experiencing miracles I once would have dismissed as mere coincidence or wishful thinking. The work that Carlo prophesied has indeed become my life's primary focus. Through the digital platforms we discussed during our morning conversations, I've been able to share his story with over 50 million people across 6 continents, resulting in countless conversions, healings, and vocational discoveries that continue to amaze and humble me. What strikes me most is how Carlo's message resonates particularly strongly with young people who, like me, initially approached faith from a place of skepticism, but found themselves irresistibly drawn to the authenticity and joy that characterized his brief but luminous life. The most profound aspect of this mission has been witnessing how Carlo's intercession continues to manifest in ways that perfectly match his personality and passions. Young programmers report receiving sudden insights about complex coding problems after praying for his help. Teenagers struggling with social media addiction find unexpected strength to establish healthy boundaries with technology. Families dealing with serious illness experience peaceful acceptance and sometimes miraculous healing after asking Carlo to pray for them. In each case, the assistance comes not as dramatic supernatural intervention, but as gentle guidance that feels completely natural and human. Carlo's mother, Antonia, has become one of my closest collaborators in spreading his message, just as he predicted during our final conversation. Together, we've traveled to more than 30 countries, carrying with us a relic of Carlo's heart, a small piece of his incorrupt body that serves as a tangible reminder of his continued presence and intercession. In every place we visit, we encounter people whose lives have been touched by Carlo's story in profound and often unexpected ways. One of the most remarkable developments has been the growth of Carlo Acutis clubs in schools and parishes around the world. Groups of young people who gather regularly to pray, study his writings, and engage in acts of service that reflect his compassionate concern for others. These clubs often focus on using technology for evangelization, creating websites, social media content, and mobile apps that help their peers discover the beauty of Eucharistic devotion. It's exactly the kind of grassroots movement that Carlo envisioned during our conversations about the future of youth ministry. Perhaps most significantly, I've experienced a personal transformation that goes far beyond my role as Carlo's biographer and advocate. My own faith has deepened in ways I never thought possible, moving from intellectual acceptance to passionate conviction rooted in daily encounters with Jesus in the Eucharist. I now attend Mass not out of obligation, but out of genuine longing to receive the grace that flows from Christ's real presence in the Blessed Sacrament. Prayer has become as natural and necessary as breathing, and I find myself constantly aware of God's presence in the ordinary moments of each day. The programming skills that initially brought Carlo and me together have been transformed into tools for evangelization that reach audiences traditional ministry might never encounter. Through carefully designed websites, mobile applications, and social media campaigns, we've been able to present Carlo's message in formats that speak directly to digital natives who consume information primarily through visual and interactive media. The responses we receive demonstrate that young people are hungry for authentic spiritual content when it's presented with intelligence, creativity, and respect for their technological fluency. As I conclude this testimony, I'm filled with gratitude for the privilege of having known Carlo Acutis, even briefly, and for being chosen to play a small role in sharing his extraordinary story with the world. His prophecy about my life's work has been fulfilled beyond anything I could have imagined. But more importantly, his influence has helped me discover my own calling to holiness and service that brings profound joy and meaning to every day. If Carlo's story has touched your heart today, I encourage you to take one simple step toward deeper faith. Whether it's spending an extra few minutes in prayer, attending Mass with greater attention and devotion, or simply asking Carlo to intercede for you in whatever struggle or need you're currently facing, I promise you'll be amazed at how quickly God responds to sincere requests made through this remarkable young saint's powerful intercession. Before you go, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who might benefit from hearing Carlo's message. In the comments below, tell us about any experiences you've had with Carlo's intercession, or simply share how his story has impacted your own faith journey. Your testimony might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear to take their own step toward holiness. Remember, as Carlo always reminded us, sanctity isn't reserved for extraordinary people. It's available to anyone willing to say yes to God's grace, one small decision at a time. Until we meet again, may Blessed Carlo Acutis pray for all of us as we strive to live with the same joy, simplicity, and authentic love that made his brief life such a powerful witness to the world.